Welcome to Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case, the podcast where we take questions I've been asked in the past from so many different roles, along with questions you'll ask and we'll ask together to, learn. Along the way, we'll build our capacity to become a community of problem solvers. I'm your host, Janice Case. Let's get to it, shall we? All right, welcome everybody to episode 17 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. Right alongside me today, of course, is the amazing Melissa Ellis. And Melissa, I'm thinking let's just take a pulse, right? Like, how are we doing? There's a lot of stuff going on in the world. So how are you on your end? What's going on with you?
I'm doing well. I'm still pretty much self-quarantining or sheltering in place, even though I'm seeing it be more and more relaxed all over the country, but even in my own town. And it scares the heck out of me, to be honest with you, because while I also see that, I see the numbers continuing to rise. A local paper here actually does like a daily report of the numbers, and they're not getting any lower. Yet I'm seeing people, just milling about. As you know, I've lost a lot of weight and I have no clothes. So I really needed a pair of jeans. And there's a local store here that I shop in, and I put it off for weeks because even though they're back up and functioning, I don't really want to expose myself to anything. I've kind of gotten used to protecting myself, my space, and my loved ones by doing so. So I did go in, I did the whole face covering thing, but they have no fitting rooms anymore. You can't try anything on. There's a certain number of people allowed in the store. So it's just interesting to me to see how, even with people trying to get back to, I don't want to say a normal life, because I hope we never go back to what was considered normal, but getting back to a more routine way of life, it's definitely impacted how we move about. I was working out this morning and saw a local church was holding service outside because they had the chairs spread far apart and everybody had on a mask. And it's just, it kind of hits you in the gut when you see actual examples of how we're changing, how the world is changing, and at least the state we're in right now when it comes to that. And it just reminded me that as much as we want COVID to be over, to be a thing of the past, it is still very, very present. And I hope that people are still taking the precautions and being safe and doing what they can to reduce the risks for themselves and others.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And it is scary. And of course, here in California, we're at the top of the list. We keep forgetting it's not a competition, but there we are. And,
but there we are.
And it's and we're not going to spend this episode talking about this. It's just kind of an update in the world, but it's a little scary when you see how little control we seem to have over it. And yet we have an awful lot of information that's constantly changing, obviously. So there's that, but it's a little bit scary to see a system like ours have so little control in this country. And to your point, we actually ventured out, I think it was last weekend, to the beach, right? Because we are getting a solid message that outdoors is better than indoors. And,
that's right.
And, you can socially distance on a beach. And we could. We got there. We had our nice little spot. In fact, what I see at the beach happening is people get there and they draw this huge square in the sand around themselves to kind of put up a barrier. And actually, people respect it. It's so funny. If you'd done that 6 months ago, people would have been like, what are you drawing that for? But now we all get it. But still... most people obviously on a beach don't have a mask on. And, we were there with some other friends and we were all kind of keeping our distance, etc. But, we came home from that and we just said to each other, okay, it's a gamble. Why? Why would we even gamble, right? So we just kind of said, we're not going to do that right now because it's to your point, I think we all have to be in kind of protective mode. In order to kind of begin to get a grasp on it. And it is tough because we did pull back here, but people can still, so the shops and stuff aren't open, but outdoor dining is open. Let's see what else. And the governor just did this really interesting thing where he basically said houses of worship, nail salons, gyms, if you can operate in a private parking lot outside, you can operate. So it's going to be really interesting around here for the next couple
of
weeks.
That will be interesting.
Yeah.
See, Janice, here, and I'm in South Carolina for the listeners, in my county, which is Beaufort County, they haven't back open and operating.
Okay.
Like, everything. Nail salons, I may be just not very educated on the subject, but I'm not aware of any restrictions that are in place other than masks are required.
Right.
But what I'm seeing, which is bothersome to me, is that stores will have up signs that say a mask is required, but they don't have a way to enforce it.
Yeah.
So people are still coming in without one. They're still being served. So it's that. It's still some of that happening here. But everything is back open and functioning. So it's very scary.
Yeah,
it is.
And
it worries me as to, like, will we ever get this thing under control, or will it
without
always
a vaccine?
Be a concern if we don't get more people being more serious about preventing the spread of it?
Well, and we know there are people on both sides of this fence, but I will say I think that's exactly where we were. The numbers started to go back up. The governor finally made a statewide mask mandate, which gave stores and stuff then the authority, even more so than they already had, because private business, you can tell people they can't come in.
Right, exactly.
And I know it's a fine line, don't get me wrong, but and so I see now, I haven't been in a grocery store or Costco. That's really kind of where I go, those two, where people don't have a mask. And in both cases, though, I do see that they're allocating a staff person to stand at the door and say, you have to have a mask on.
See, we don't.
Yeah.
We had that when things first started and things were getting rough. Like the grocery stores even had someone standing at the main entrance to ensure that only a certain number came in and that people had on masks. That's not happening anymore. The only places I go, there's a convenience store across the street that I go to for gas and ice, because I'm an ice fanatic. And there's also like the grocery store. Those are really the only places that I go other than work. But working from home. But in the convenience store, masks are hit or miss. And I think it may just be the case of they could very well enforce it, but I don't think anyone wants to risk the anger or the yelling or the, so it's kind of that.
Yeah.
But everything here is open and pretty much fully operational with the requirement that a mask be worn. So it's going to be interesting to see how it goes as we move forward.
Well, right, because even more important than for yourself individually to say, I'm just going to stay home. Absolutely. I'm just going to stay home and keep myself safe. And I do, one last thing on that, I do really appreciate that. We're starting to see the correlation between wearing masks and the economy, right? Like, we could have our economy open if people wear masks and social distance.
That's right.
I like the idea of tying those things, and I agree with it wholeheartedly, that, if we take our steps, whether you believe the masks help or not, right?
Exactly.
Like, put that aside. Put it aside, right? Exactly.
Right.
What could it hurt? And tie those two things together, because I feel like, we're all worried about the economy, and so if you're worried about it and this could help us get there, then let's all do our part.
Right.
So, all right, folks, that's your COVID-19 PSA from myself and Melissa. Take it for what it will be. So I'm going to shift us in thinking about today's episode, because today's episode is going to be, of course, continuing our conversation around institutionalized racism in this country. And we said last time, we talked a little bit about this concept of system, and we said last time that, we were going to spend the bulk of our time this season really thinking about this in terms of what it looks like across a variety of subsystems. And today we're going to think about it in terms of education. We're going to start to think about it in terms of education. It did occur to me, though, as I was prepping for this episode, that I want to clarify some terms, because we keep hearing interchangeably the terms systemic racism and institutionalized racism. So like any good American, I Googled for a point of clarification, systemic racism versus institutionalized or institutional racism. And basically the different resources I found all kind of agree that both of them refer to how ideas of white superiority are captured in everyday thinking at a systems level. So taking in the big picture of how society operates rather than looking at one-on-one interactions, right? Interactions. So the system, not just the one-on-one. Of course, the system is built on all of those one-on-one interactions. And I went on to look at a particular resource that talked about these systems can include the laws and regulations that contribute to systemic or institutional racism, but also unquestioned social systems, which I think is really important, is really going to actually be a part of what we're talking about today. So, for example, unquestioned social systems like obviously our system of education. Within that system of education, things like hiring practices or access to certain opportunities, etc. So I say that to say to folks, we'll be using those terms interchangeably, right? If we say systemic, if we say institutional or institutionalized racism, we are saying the same thing. We're talking about how the individual small pieces contribute to a larger systemic system. Sorry, systemic system. I know that's probably incorrect grammar, and that's what we're going to be kind of working toward. So it's always my concern, like I said, I think in last episode, that when we use the word system, people are like, yeah, gotcha. But when you actually ask people to drill into the concept and tell you what it looks like, we struggle because it's actually kind of gray for us. So I think as we move forward, our goal is to help regular people like us, right? Just understand the concreteness of systemic or institutionalized racism in this country, right? We begin to tackle that goal then today in this episode by beginning a conversation about institutionalized racism in our system of education in this country. So today we're going to meet Jamison, Joan, and Henri Williams Curcio. All cards are on the table, folks. These are members of my family, and so their story is already very personal for me. And it is absolutely our hope that starting with their story will tug at people's heartstrings, right? The truth be told, we want to grab you emotionally first, and then follow that in a future episode with a practical conversation, if you will, on how to change our systems of education in this country, why they have to change in our quest to dismantle systemic racism in this country. Today will be about education, future episodes about other subsystems of our society here in this country. So we know that their story is going to touch you, and we're going to begin this idea of how we dismantle with it. So with that, let's get to it. All right, so joining us today, of course, I have Joan and Jamison and Henri, and of course, right out of the gate, I want to thank all three of you for being here and being willing to kind of open your personal lives up a little bit, and frankly, the kind of the willingness to be vulnerable in doing so with all of us, so that we can learn from some of the experiences and from the things that you share. So thank you for that. I would love for you guys to start by just introducing yourselves. And Joan, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, well, I'm Joan Curcio, and I'm Jamison's mom.
I like it. That's pretty much to the point.
I'm Jamison. I use she, her pronouns, and I am 22. And currently I'm at home with my parents in upstate New York, which is great.
Oh, see, I love that. She can say that several months later, since we're all still at home, right, living the pandemic life. So that's great. And Jamison, thank you for clarifying the pronoun piece, because I often wonder that in different circumstances. So when you do that right out of the gate, it just makes it clear. I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very nice. And Henri?
Henri Williams, Jamison's dad.
Love it, right? That keeps it simple. Doesn't it make it simple when we can just say we are somebody's mother and father and move on? We're good to go. All right. So what you guys have done is agreed to tell a bit of a story, right? You have so many things that you can share, and it's certainly my hope, selfishly, that you will share perhaps in future episodes of this podcast that are going to tie really importantly into the overall focus on institutional racism or systemic racism in this country. And but today we're going to focus on a story that's going to be led by Jamison about her experience as a Black student, in this case, a Black young woman, a Black middle schooler at the time of the story, and her experience with what it was like to endeavor, if you will, in the school environment. And Joan and Henri, of course, the three of you I know have done a lot of talking, so I'm not going to put too many parameters on this, except to say you all are all going to kind of jump in, and we're just going to kind of see where the story takes us and what we can take from it. All right, Jamison, it's all you, friend.
All right. So the actual incident that happened on my birthday, which is March 13th, 2012. So I was turning 14. So at the time, you're super excited. You bring in cookies to share with friends. And we were all at our lockers getting ready for first period. And two kids who were in my classes donned KKK hoods. And in that moment, I remember being super shocked, kind of taken away by what was happening, but also catching the reactions of all my other peers. So there was a lot of people who were equally as shocked. There were some people that were laughing. There were people that were saying, that's so racist and that's really wrong. But it was a really quick 15-second moment. And then we all went about our day. And I think what kind of sat with me throughout the day was, yes, it was my birthday, so this was memorable, but also innately I knew that this was wrong. And so I remember being at my birthday dinner and then kind of just telling my parents what had happened, because I felt that was the right thing to do. And so an investigation ensued, and ultimately the outcome of what happened was the superintendent thought that it would be best if I skip a grade. So I skip into the 9th grade, so you can look at it as I completed 3 years of high school, 3 years and 3 months. Right. But essentially, on March 26th was my first day entering into the high school. And so I had to learn basically 7 months of 9th grade material, was expected to pass all the Regents exams on top of the other tests that were required in order to pass the 10th grade. So that's a small kind of summary.
Brief synopsis.
Brief, quite brief. But yeah.
So let me dig a little bit, if that's okay. And I've said this before, but I'm going to say it to you again, to all three of you. I'm going to dig, and you're going to stop me where you want to stop me, right? I mean, that's how this goes. So this happens in the hallway, right? These two white boys don KKK hats and then take them off, right? For whatever reason, and maybe you all get to that as far as any kind of explanation, but and of course, you're affected by that. You understand innately that it's wrong, and then you share it with your parents, as you said. So Joan and Henri, I know over the years I've heard some of the recounting of I'm going to call it the ordeal that you went through in attempting to get the school and the district to recognize that this behavior was racist in nature and therefore should be dealt with accordingly. I'd love to have you all share a little bit of that part of the experience with our listeners so they get a sense of what happened between Jamison's summary of, this happened, and then, which, by the way, from the 13-year-old, this is what you see, right? This happened, and now I'm going to high school, right? So
Exactly.
If you guys could fill in a little bit and give us some sense of what you endeavored in this.
Yeah, so I'll jump in, and then probably Henri can give you much more detail about how we dealt with it, because he was basically the primary person who did that. But so we were at dinner with Jamison on her birthday with her best friend, and she told us this story, and we were just shocked and almost to the point of not believing that this that it could be true. So the next day, Henri went in, I believe, to talk to the principal, or wrote an email to the principal, and the principal initiated an investigation. And in that investigation, they spoke with a lot of the kids so Jamison had given them a list of the kids who were in there.
Sure.
So there was an interview person, and those kids went in and talked about what happened. And most of the kids were like, that didn't happen, basically. They just denied that it happened or that it was that it was basically, that's her interpretation, but we didn't see that. And there was also, so I can't remember, was it that, so it was in an area of the school that was hard to film because it was like between lockers where the bathroom was, and there's like a, you know how it goes in a little bit. And so it was right in that area. And I'm not sure if it was due to the fact that it was in that area or that the cameras weren't working, but basically they didn't get it on film. So it was an issue of, you know, he said, she said. Mm-hmm. There were a couple of kids, 2 kids as I remember, who said, yes, indeed, this happened. That's exactly how they interpret it. But basically the school made the decision that, you know, this was really not the incident that she described.
Okay.
But in the meantime, the kids in the process of being interviewed figured out that it was Jamison who had reported this incident. And so maybe you can describe better than I can exactly what happened.
I was going to ask. Once they figured out, right? Once they figured out, sure.
So, how the process specifically works in my school, which maybe happens in other schools, but you have to write down a statement and then they kind of collect it in a folder. And that's what they were doing with all of the students. And the person who was running the interviews had left my statement out. So when another student was in the room, they saw not only my name, but they also saw exactly what I wrote.
Sure.
So when that happened, there was this kind of plan to basically like beat me up, to intimidate me, and to the point where I decided not to go to class, and I was in the bathroom and I was calling my dad. I was like, please come pick me up.
Yeah.
Like, I can't be in this classroom.
Yeah,
they found out that it was me, and I just didn't feel safe anymore.
Sure. And I think it was a friend of yours told you, right? A friend of yours told you that this was going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who was that? I can't remember.
Sarah.
It was Sarah. Okay. Right. So, so the next day after this happens, we get a phone call from, or Henri got a phone call from Jamison saying, I'm in the bathroom, come get me, come rescue me. And so he did that. And then we went back to the school, and the principal's like, okay, we're going to have a meeting, basically, and talk about how we can handle this situation. And I'm actually now going to turn it over to you because you probably remember that meeting much.
Yeah.
Well, if I may, you know, and it's hard to tell this story without putting it in context.
Please.
And I don't know if this was your intention.
Absolutely.
But, you know, when you start off talking about systematic racism, so to put the story in context, when Jamison was going into middle school, it was timed with the principal coming into that middle school who had a documented history of issues at other schools based on insensitive racial issues with the students.
Okay.
It led to his termination or being removed as vice principal or in some administrative position in 2 districts.
Okay.
Prior to him taking over as principal for the middle school, I always knew it was important to be involved in the school. I've always been in the PTA. I was on the citywide safety committee.
Okay.
And I always believe if you're not involved, you're not at the table, then things just go by.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
So as a result of that, I was invited to a meeting of several parents who had some concerns with him coming into as principal of the middle school with the most diverse middle school in Albany and his history, how are you going to, for lack of a better word, administrate the school?
Sure.
During this discussion, I and others listened to, oh yeah, that really didn't happen that way. And, I hate to put it this way, Janice, but usually when someone eventually goes to, yeah, and I grew up with the black guy next door who was just like my brother, AKA I'm not a racist, it's like, I left that meeting saying, okay, he's coming in, but I'm going to be vigilant.
Sure.
From day one, I documented and emailed back and forth to the school the several microaggressions that happened in, when did you start? 6th grade, 7th grade. So by 8th grade, I had 2 years of emails of other incidents that were related to the bullying that was going on in the school that demonstrated the school's lack of response. So by the time we got to this incident, and when Jamie tells me this, I follow up. Again, I always learned from my dad, you can't prove a phone call.
That's it.
I emailed every time. I would follow up with this phone call. By the way, I emailed you.
Right.
Because when it came to the civil rights suit, it was my emails that brought this home.
Okay.
It showed that I had over years documented concerns. It showed no response on the school's part because there was no response emails to my concerns. And in terms of this incident, eventually it led to, I sent all the emails, Mr. Polino convenes this meeting, we all go in, we sit down for 3 hours. And at the end of this, their solution was, let's have a sensitivity meeting where we're going to put Jamison in a room with the bullies and their parents and talk about how this feels.
Oh, wow.
We immediately said, no, we are not doing that. And it was at that point I went to the Albany City Commission of Human Rights. I met with them, their committee. They then eventually got in touch with the superintendent of the school district, which then led to us meeting with the superintendent of the school district. And that's when they came up with the solution, which we then learned as a result of the civil rights suit, they were in fault. They should have removed the bullies and the people who were the perpetrators of this rather than moving Jamison to the high school.
But although, I think at the time, at least for me, and I think for Jamison, I know this through conversation with her, that we didn't feel any choice. We didn't feel, she didn't feel safe in the school. She didn't feel that really anyone had her back except for some teachers who were certainly willing to talk to you and express their concern about you, but that's as far as they were willing to go. They weren't willing to stand up to the school or the principal. They were just simply, we're on your side. And I don't mean that meant a lot. I remember that meant a lot at the time, but there wasn't any way that she could stay there. The environment was very hostile.
You couldn't even ride home on the school bus. So after this incident and the revelation of, because they didn't protect Jamison's name in the investigation. So now you had many students being told, oh, Jamison's a snitch. She's on the public bus coming home, being confronted by a student on the bus, which led to an incident. The parent then complains to the principal. They call me up. Once I explained what actually happened, the father said, oh, never mind. Let's forget about this.
So, and there are pieces that you're sharing that I recall hearing in previous conversations that we've had. And I appreciate, Henri, you sharing the contextual piece, because that is really important, right? It's not like everything was all fine for 2 years and then out of nowhere, right? Right, you had this. And Joan, your point is so well taken, and Jamison, I'll just say that you're sitting there nodding, so for our listeners, right, who can't see you, but that this idea that by the time the school board or the superintendent came up with the solution of Jamison moving to high school, absolutely she shouldn't have been the one to move, right? Of course not. But in that moment, even if they had moved the bullies, it was not a place that she could have continued, right? Like you're this sense that there are so many things about the system that is this school, not just this one incident, but how this system that is this school was working, that, I mean, what I'm taking away, we're working against you, right? And at any point I summarize something, by the way, and I'm not quite accurate, correct me, all right? So
well,
how
you're
much?
Right, because one of the findings was address the structure of the school.
Okay.
Was part of the complaint was the way they set up the honor system, which literally segregated certain students within the school building, which minimized their ability to even be supported and resourced.
Interesting.
For example, if you were a student of color in the honors students, you were literally segregated from the rest of the school and dealing in classes that were predominantly white.
Got it. Yeah. So just that by the nature of, so Henri, that's so interesting, which is why I know we'll have a future conversation about systemness of education, right? And the implications from a racial perspective, because when you think about that, right, just the simple act of creating, for lack of a better word, tracks, right? Honors classes versus regular classes, as an example. Just that simple act, which is supposedly academically based, inherently creates a systemness to racism in an environment, right? For the very reason that you just said. Yeah, for the very reason you just said. So there was a period of time between when kind of a series of microaggressions, Henri, that you mentioned, kind of leading up then to 8th grade, when this kind of larger, if you will, or this very specific incident occurred. From that moment until the moment you moved, Jamison, I feel like you said it was maybe like a few weeks. Do I have that about right? So all of this is happening within a few weeks.
Yes. Yeah, so to be exact, what that means, maybe like a week and a half, almost
13 days, right? Because
the 26th.
On the 13th, and you started high school on the 26th.
Yeah,
there's another reason for this, Janice,
okay.
And just not to forget this.
Yeah.
At some point, looking at what are our options, I finally had someone said, seek out a lawyer.
Okay.
And it was seeking out the lawyer and getting into technicalities of when did I first write to the school administration and how much of a window did I have in order to file a complaint with the feds. And we had a 90-day window.
Okay.
So part of the speed up was we had to act very quickly in moving forward the complaint to even get heard. Based on the time frame.
Because at that point,
once that started, things started to move quickly.
Then it went quickly, right? And I want to come back to the details of that in just a second, but because at that point, Jamison, day one it happens, day two you're in a bathroom calling your dad to come save you because it's not safe, and then there's another kind of 11 days where all of this is happening. During which, did you go back to school on day 3, or was it kind of, so tell me about that. So you went back to school, and then you're dealing with all the other stuff, the bus incident and all the other, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I kind of didn't have a choice. I had to go back to school. And a lot of it, what was going through my head was, I had to be really strong.
Yeah.
I had to be really strong because I was losing friends.
Okay.
I was losing friends, and I was also losing parents' friends as well, who I considered to be my parents as well. Yeah. So I really felt this sense of isolation. And so every day going in, I had to do it for myself. And I felt this big pressure that I also had to do it for my family, who was coming into the school to support me. So that was really big. Yeah. So, yeah, even more incidents happened. So, there's just like a lot of taunting. There's a lot of, well, is it even safe to ride the school bus anymore? Because I would take the school bus in the morning and after school.
Tell Janice about the incident with, what was his name? Dan.
Well, you don't need his...
Oh, okay. You know what I'm talking about. On the school bus.
Yeah. So yeah, it was just really about survival for me. And really what saved me was dance. Okay. I had three really great friends at dance, and they all went to different schools from the area. But that's what got me through. Okay. And that's what pushed me through, to ignore everything that was happening as best as I could. To stand up to people, even though they said stuff on the bus continuously, even though people said stuff on Twitter, social media was involved. Yeah. It was really dance what got me through until the decision was made for me to skip and then kind of figure out how to move on.
How to get through that and be able to be in 9th grade. So I want to go back just for a second to the two boys in the hallway. Yeah. Did you ever get a sense of why they would do something like that? Or did we never even get there because the school just took the position, well, we can't even really prove it because there's not a lot of, did you ever get any sense of that? And I don't know if that matters to you. It's just a wondering that I have.
I think from my point of view, I will never really understand why. Yeah. Just because my understanding is they were at a different middle school that was considered to be the better middle school, and they were put in the middle school that I was in 7th grade because they were bullied. Oh, interesting. So I thought, maybe they just are really insecure, but that's not an excuse for racist behavior. Of course. And so, yeah, I've never figured out myself why they personally felt the need to do it. And even being in the same high school as them, they still were the same people. So, and there's never been a discussion. So I also couldn't say what they would say. Yeah.
Well, and I can see how at some point you just kind of have to leave it and say, okay, it's going to be an unanswered question. Interesting that they were put in that school because they were bullied at another school, right? Like that, again, a whole other interesting system kind of issue, system breakdown kind of an issue. So thank you for sharing that.
You could look at it in terms of power so there's 2 middle schools in Albany, and one of them is in a predominantly white neighborhood, and the other is in a predominantly black neighborhood. And there is a kind of lottery system, or at the time there was a lottery system, right, for getting into the schools. Or no?
It's a feeder system.
Well, there was a lottery system, and then there was this vote. And basically what they decided was, depending on what public schools you went to, you would then have an automatic, into either this middle school or that middle school.
Whatever elementary school you went, certain elementary schools fed into one middle school.
So it was a feeder,
Yeah, that feeder system came about during the time that Jamison was in middle school. And so in the Albany community, there's definitely this feeling that this school in the white neighborhood is a good school, and the school in the black neighborhood is a bad school. Okay. And so I think that, that for those kids to be in that good school and have been bullied out of it.
Right. Interesting.
And then sent to this, what's viewed as a bad school, I think for them and their family, I believe, because these are people that we know.
Yeah.
Or knew, that it was really about a feeling of loss of power.
Okay.
Loss of white power.
Okay.
And the need to be powerful over someone else. That's my sense of it.
Well, again, it brings up a whole topic, if you will, of if you have schools situated like that, right, and there's no action taken to mitigate that, then you're kind of landing on this idea of white power is as good as any rationale, if you will, right? Because it kind of makes a lot of sense. Henri, go ahead. I can tell you've got some things to add.
Well, no. I mean, and again, and maybe this is another discussion. But this just reminds me, I went to those school board meetings when the feeder system was being proposed.
Okay.
I listened to white parents in the audience screaming and yelling about, you promised me that my kid will always be able to go to this school. I mean, literally, I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
This is incredible.
Yeah.
And then, as I'm sitting here and we're thinking about accountability, so I go back to my story about Polino, the principal, that coming in had this shadow. We now have the incident. We now have the Federal Office of Civil Rights say, yes, there was discrimination. Yes, the school failed. Yes, they did this. Yes, this didn't happen. And he's still the principal.
Wow.
To this day.
Wow. So, which is just one more example, right? Why it's so important for us to be having the conversations we're having, but more importantly on a larger scale for the efforts that are being made right now in our communities and all over the country, right? And to create change. And this is just, for me, it's just such a personal example, right? This very personal story of yours, Jamison, at this one middle school in this one place in this one state is such an example of what's happening every single day right now in schools across the country. I mean, that's just the truth, right? We know that's the truth. And so to your dad's point, for a system structure to allow that it can happen, you can do all the right things, take all the right steps. And I want to dig into those for a second in just a moment, and have it exposed for what it is, and then still leave the people who made all the mistakes in charge of what happens next in the lives of kids. That's terrifying to me on a lot of levels. But Henri, tell us a little bit about, and I asked this part because it's my hope that there are going to be people listening who say, wait, back up. Like, what did you have to do? Like, who did you have to call in order to, to get a civil rights complaint, for example, filed in order to have the school assessed externally for around this? Can you just highlight a couple of those key steps for folks who might need them in their own lives?
Well, fortunately, in talking to some of our friends who were truly sensitive to what we were going through, eventually said, you need to talk to a lawyer.
Okay.
And this particular lawyer who I've stayed friendly with, and he's a very nice guy. So we met and he heard our story, and maybe I'm paraphrasing, but he pretty much cut to the chase. You're not going to get anywhere trying to fight Albany and the Albany School Board. You need to file a civil rights suit.
Okay.
But he was very specific about the parameters of that, what you needed to at least demonstrate and the time frames under which that had to have been submitted in terms of when the incident actually occurred.
Okay.
And I bring that up because, I shared this with Jamison and Joan when we were talking about this. This didn't end when you went to high school. We ended up filing subsequent suits.
Right.
And had the benefit of this decision to then say, here we go, here's continued acts of discriminatory behavior.
Okay.
But it all started with, you had to start that process within a time frame and get it going.
So the Office of Civil Rights finding the school to have been in violation was the basis for which you could then move forward with suits against the district, I assume, in order to, in my mind, the assumption I'm making, in order to kind of force them to take some other kind of action?
Well, one thing as a result of that was they forced the city of Albany to change, policies.
Okay, how so?
Bullying. They forced every teacher in the district to go through training.
Okay.
There were...
They offered counseling to every black child who had been in the school in that school year.
Oh, wow.
There were several things, but we were incredibly lucky that our friends told us about this lawyer and that we met with this lawyer, because it was not a suit. It was a civil rights complaint. We had to file it ourselves. Like, he couldn't file it for us. And basically, he gave us that advice, and then we went forward with the complaint. And it probably took, 6 months or so. But then there was a federal lawyer who came in and interviewed everyone, the superintendent, the principal, the teachers involved, the students involved. And then maybe about another 6 months passed, and they came out with a decision that Jamison's rights had been violated, that there was definitely, so all along throughout the whole incident and throughout those 13 days, there was very much this message from the school, Jamison's peers, our friends, that we had really completely overblown this
interesting
childish prank.
Okay.
Where those weren't actually KKK hoods. They looked like them, but they were actually Halloween costumes that they had put on in March.
Yep.
And that basically this was not, we had completely misinterpreted, was really what the school said, we had friends working in the school system. That's basically what they tried to make us believe. And, so that in the civil rights suit, they said, no, this was not a prank. This was a racist event. And part of the way that we know this was that these two kids had been involved in bullying Jamie in another event that was race-based in the classroom, that there had been, as Henri said, many incidents that he had reported that the school had basically had the same reaction, you're kind of blowing this out of proportion. So the suit, the complaint, the decision of the complaint basically said this was racial bullying, and importantly, that they handled that wrong. That it was Jamison's right to have the bullies removed from her environment. That she should stay in that environment, and the environment should be made safe.
Exactly.
Rather than be removed from that environment. So her rights had been violated in that way. And I guess I a little bit disagree with the idea that the school could not have changed yes, it would have taken massive change,
Sure.
and I don't believe the principal could have done it. But the reason I say that is because when Jamison went to high school, she faced many other incidents of bullying, even by a teacher. But the high school was on it in 5 seconds.
Okay.
You know, we would go in and say this happened, or Jamison report something that happened, and they were on it. They took care of it. They squelched it.
Okay.
And that made a huge difference.
Yeah.
It didn't take it away.
Yeah, of course.
But it was an environment where she could at least go in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? She could go in and feel like.
And she could feel safe knowing, and Jamison, put words in your mouth, but that people were going to listen, people were going to take action, people weren't going to make assumptions and minimize, you know, the concern that you had, etc.
Yeah, and I would say that, like, I think part of the minimizing was that people were calling what happened bullying, when really, like, it was racial discrimination and it was racial violence.
Yeah.
And so then in the high school, yes, I had a complaint in the decision and people kind of knew who I was.
Sure.
So I think there was that intimidation factor. But I think people also knew that I could define what racial discrimination was. I knew what it looked like. And there was a complaint, a decision that believed that I also knew what that was. So I was able to really use that to my advantage and, like, as protection, and then create a support system within the school.
Okay.
In high school that allowed me to feel that I could take action and be protected against many other racial discrimination acts that happened.
So, I mean, it sounds like, you know, just by the sheer act of having that decision behind you, it kind of gave you some street cred. Like you said, people you knew what racial discrimination was, what it looked like, what it sounded like, and you weren't afraid to call it what it was. And that, like you said, you had the backing of an outside source that says, yep, she knows exactly what she's talking about. I really do appreciate, and I think it's important that you helped us, by the way, to flesh out racial discrimination from bullying, because we do use bullying to catch a whole lot of stuff, right? And I think moving forward, one of the things that has to be different is that we have to call it what it is, because I hate to say it, but in this country, we're a little bit desensitized to the idea of bullying right now. So it's real easy to say, oh, it's just bullying, which is horrible to say, but there's a little bit of that, I feel like. So certainly putting, you know, separating this out is going to be a really key piece. Go ahead, Henri.
Well, you know, and I kind of mentioned this to them yesterday, and again, you know, and this doesn't mean to take away from our personal experience, but it has to be put in context, you know. And I said to them, I'm a professional. Any day of the week, at any time, I can come into the school and have a meeting.
Yep.
You know, not every parent can do that.
Yeah.
We, going into the high school, had the benefit of a civil rights decision that came about because we were able to pay for a lawyer and do certain things, which in some ways enabled Jamison to have, you know, what we said, they paid for a psychologist for the rest of her high school. Any given day she could go now.
Right.
Not every Black student had that opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we addressed her issue.
Hardly any Black students have that opportunity.
But in the scheme of, did we really change the system? Did every Black student who was experiencing very similar things that Jamison was experiencing have those same outcomes? No, they did not.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
And to me, you know, that is also indicative of part of the problem, you know. And I said to them yesterday, to some degree, and, you know, I'll own this, I probably took advantage of the fact that, yeah, we had a civil rights decision that meant on any given day I could walk into the school and meet with any of the principals and would meet with me. They knew my name.
Right.
But I also knew there are many other students who are going through just as many terrible things and harassments, and they did not have that same opportunity.
Yeah. But Henri, I think it's important that you recognize that, and you use the expression, I probably took advantage of, and I would suggest that white parents do that all the time, without even realizing that's what it is, right? In some cases, not even realizing that just by virtue of being a professional white person, I can walk into the school and expect that if I ask to meet with somebody, somebody's going to meet with me. And so, I don't think that, I think it's, what do I say this? I think it's the nature of parenting that if you have an advantage for your kid, you're going to use the advantage for your kid, right? Especially when you have had to navigate a process to just ensure the basic safety, right? Let's just ensure that she's safe when she shows up there and when she leaves again.
But what you just told me is very important of perception. So after this incident, we met with the principal and the security officer.
Mm-hmm.
3 hours we actually met with them.
Wow.
During this conversation, the intervention person talked about at times when they had to intervene with Black students, they literally had to go to their house and knock on the door and wake them up as if what I got the impression was because Black parents didn't show up in schools or behave like what you described as white parents, there was a sense of, well, they didn't care.
Yeah.
Or they weren't valuing education in the same way, so why should we care?
Yep.
And oh my God, my response was, did it ever occur to you that that person works at the post office and gets off at 6 o'clock in the morning and at 10 o'clock you're knocking on the door when they're sleeping?
Yep. That's it. That perception piece is going to be so key to, I think, a lot of our conversations. And this idea that every single person who walks through the door, kid, parent, whatever, right? We have to make, that's not the right way to say it, that there's a series of assumptions that we're naturally going to jump to. And so the way we break down the systemness of racism in schools, in part, is to recognize the thought as an assumption and back up and look for evidence of what's actually happening, right?
Let's talk about PTA.
Yeah.
I was active in the PTA religiously.
Yeah.
There was this theme that certain parents didn't care because they didn't show up.
Yep.
Let's talk about the single parent with a couple of kids.
Yeah.
The PTA is usually Tuesday, Wednesday evening in the evening who don't have the ability to manage the after school and feed my kids and show up at the PTA meeting. That doesn't mean they don't value education.
Yep.
And so what I proposed at times was, can we shift the PTA meeting to a time that might be more accommodating to everyone, like a Saturday, like at 10 o'clock or something?
Yeah.
And you got so much resistance to this.
Well, right. That's the way we've always done it.
The idea was, wouldn't that make sense if we really wanted to embrace everyone being involved?
Yep. That's exactly right. And I will say this, and then I want to back up just a little bit. One of the side effects, if you will, of COVID. And it's kind of interesting how this side effect, I feel like, intersects with the work that we're doing, from a racial injustice perspective, but is that for the first time, we're really seeing into kids' homes for the first time, right? Really seeing into kids' homes. After, don't get me wrong, we're still working on getting every kid a device and every kid gets Wi-Fi and every kid, but more than ever before, we're seeing into so many more kids' homes. And to your point, Henri, the conversations that I'm having with the partners that I work with in education is they're astounded that they're having Zoom meetings for parents, for committees, for PTAs, for, even school board meetings. They're having Zoom meetings because they have to. And hundreds of parents are showing up. When they're in-person, meetings, they can hardly get a few to show up. And we've been surprised. And to your point, I've said, but doesn't it make sense? Because now as a parent, no matter where I am or what's happening in my world, maybe I'm the parent who's at home with 2 kids and I have no childcare. I can get on my computer and I can listen in that way. You've created a new, way for me, a new door in for me. And I think that so that's one, right? And so how do we use that, moving forward? But the second piece is the act of teachers and school leaders seeing into kids' homes and starting to have to really face what it is that some of our kids who need the most are carrying around and are and the context in which they're living. That before it was easy to kind of know, like, I know you're living in poverty, I know you're in my class and you have free and reduced lunch. But it's one thing to know you're on that list. It's another thing to see into your home and realize how much you're struggling, right, on a different level. And we're still only getting glimpses, but it's more than we ever have before. So the question becomes now, what do we do with that, right? Because we can't ignore it, right? You can't unknow it once you know it. So what do we do with that? So Jamison, talk to us a little bit about then some of your kind of big takeaways from this, and your parents and you have all said like, this wasn't the only one, right? It was the big incident with respect that, you had an OCR, you filed an actual report, you did all those things. And I don't want to lose sight of your dad's point about the fact that you could only do that because you had two parents who are professionals who feel confident about navigating a system. And that part of what we're going to have to do moving forward is figure out how we create pathways for all parents to be able to do what your parents could do for you. But talk to us a little bit about, I want to say takeaways, but I don't want to limit it to that. What's important to you about this part of your life and kind of what it means to you now?
What it means to me now. I think I learned a lot about agency, and a lot of times, I'm called resilient, or I'm really strong, but I just think it comes from, I knew innately that what had happened was wrong, and I don't necessarily need all those labels.
Yeah.
If things were just done right,
yeah.
I'd be in a very different place. So as my parents were kind of speaking on, this wasn't the only incident. Probably the first real incident I can really remember that happened in the school district was in 5th grade, and then it never stopped. It continued in high school, which is why an incident occurred with my name, which is why I no longer use my legal name, Jamie.
Okay.
And it continued through college. So racial traumatization is also a very real thing.
Yeah.
Racial
PTSD.
PTSD is very real. So I think for me, the takeaway is that it's going to be a learning process to undo a lot of the trauma that I have experienced. But in a way that I have coped or I have tried to deal with it is through, as I mentioned earlier, dance, my group of friends who I had at dance, and carried that on through college. So my mom actually pointed it out earlier in a conversation that we had. But in college, I got to work my very first job, which was at the Center for Race, Equity, and Identity, and I was a program assistant. And that was really transformative because I actually had a support system within a school system that was actively fighting against the system that we were all in. So looking at a restorative justice kind of model, and then also some transformative justice abolishment methods as well. And then also at the end of my freshman year, I started the Dancers of Color Coalition, which is a club that creates safe space for artists of color. And that fall, we had our very first showcase. I think in wanting to create space for other people to feel seen and represented, but also represented with protection. And if I could do that with the privilege and the knowledge that I gained from being able to file a complaint and understanding the decision and understanding that evidence is key, if I can use that to help other people who might not have that through the arts in some capacity, through working in a department that has those resources as a program assistant, then this is what I'm meant to do with my life. Yeah.
Really appreciate you sharing that way. And I appreciate you introducing, it's an introduction for me, I'm sure it's not for others, but introducing the language of racial traumatization, And the idea, right, that we know this, that PTSD can be very specific to types of trauma that a person experiences. This is the first time I've heard somebody say racial traumatization and PTSD, and it makes perfect sense, right? So thank you for introducing that. The other piece that I think is really important, and I'm going to say this out loud now so that I think about it later, and that is that part of using our voice has to also be about understanding the system that's in place and how to navigate it, right? Is actually spending some time to learn how to navigate it, or to reach out to people who can support us in learning how to navigate it, because that was a very kind of high level, if you will, of using your voice, right? Using the systems that are in place to get your voice amplified so that you get justice on some level, right? So that's important. All right, so I'm going to shift us as we kind of head to wrapping up our conversation, you guys. And I want to almost kind of go back to the beginning on some level, because what we didn't do in our introductions is make it clear for our folks who are listening who can't see, right? That Joan, you are a white woman. Jamison is, of course, a black woman. I think we've established that. And Henri is a black man. And so with that, Joan, I think that it'll be important for us to hear your thoughts. I asked Jamison a couple of minutes ago about what about this whole experience is important to her now, right? And why? And she was incredibly eloquent in sharing kind of who she's become in part as a result of her experiences, of course. So I'll kind of shift the same question for you with respect to, as a white woman raising a black daughter, right? What has that meant for you, and what are some of the things that you take away from that would be important for some of us to hear and understand?
I think one of the things that I adopted Jamie as an infant,
teeny tiny
and
little.
when I was a single mother.
Yep.
And at that time in my life, my feeling about it was that, I had, gone to classes to learn about adoptions. And
Sure.
One of the things that they said is, well, wherever you adopt from, you should be interested in that culture. You should be open to learning about that culture and to bringing that culture to your kid. And so it immediately, to me, it was like, well, I'm really interested in Black culture.
Sure.
And, that's a possibility that as a single parent, I could adopt a Black child, which is a whole other conversation.
Sure.
So I felt that, I felt like I could handle it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I could be a white parent of a Black child.
Yeah.
But I think that in being her parent was not so much that I couldn't handle it, but that I really could never know
Yeah.
what it was like to walk in her shoes.
Yeah.
I could never understand. This is going to sound crazy, but I really couldn't tell her what the consequences of her actions were going to be.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times parents feel like, if you step in front of that car, you're going to get hit.
Sure.
Like they feel very confident about that they can interpret the world for their kid in terms of consequences. They can explain to their kid what the consequences of their actions were. But I felt like even when she was a toddler, that is not the reaction that she got. There was a different set of rules for her.
Yeah.
I felt that very powerfully. And even though I don't think it's something that I can explain very well, it's just that it's very clear to me that Black people experience the world very differently than white people. Reactions of everyone to Black people are very different
Yeah.
than even babies.
Yeah.
And so I think that what that did for me was it really forced me to include. It sort of brought home, that Khalil Gibran poem,
Yeah.
Your child is not your child. It really brought that home to me. And that, for example, something would happen in school. There would be some, bad event that would happen. And whereas I think a lot of parents can say, well, really you ought not to talk back to your teacher because that's not what you want to do. That's not right. It's like I couldn't do that for her because I couldn't really the consequences of her behavior were not predictable to me. So I really had to, I remember this from a very young age, sort of working out with her, like, what if this happens? And what if this is the consequence? And is that what you want to do? Is that what you want to handle it? Do you remember that about childhood? Yeah. A lot of times we would spend a lot of time discussing, like, how are you going to handle this? What are the potential consequences? And how are you going to feel about that? And even though I think that there are ways in which that was extraordinarily painful, because the messages that I got from my, white parent cohorts, was that I was doing that all wrong. And a lot of times that was also true of the black parent cohorts, that I was doing that all wrong. But for me, it really, I don't think I had this confidence at the time at all. But looking back on it, I just think she's her own person now.
Yeah.
She's her own person. And she defines her own successes.
Yeah.
She's not a kind of person who is basically like, look, Mom, I got an A on this or whatever. It's much more about sort of, I don't know, I guess she has, I feel a much more holistic view of accomplishment, achievement, than a lot of kids her age do.
Yeah.
And I see that. I get that feedback from people as well. I know that, just in instances where, for example, we've had, like last summer, we met a lot of the people that she worked with last summer and very much got that feedback. Like, oh my God, it's like she's, a 40-year-old adult in a 20-year-old body or something. And I think that's very true. Like, she's a very wise soul, because at such a young age, she had a lot of, I don't even want to call it freedom. It was really more like processing.
Well, she had responsibility for herself, it sounds like, based on, you know what I mean? As I'm listening to you, it was because, all parents think we're going to be able to figure it out for our kids. All parents on some level want to chart our kids' path, even though we shouldn't, right? But you realized very early on that you couldn't, because to your point, if you hadn't walked in the shoes, there was absolutely no way that you could then help her predict what could happen. And so early on, she had to take a lot of kind of responsibility for, making her decisions with you, but not certainly by herself, but leading the process to make those decisions and take responsibility versus following, which is what we tend to do in a parenting perspective. One thing I want to, if you don't mind, I'm going to read it real quick from
the exchanges that you and I have had, because I think this is important. And then I want to kind of, Henri, I'm coming to you next to wrap up. But I think this is important because part of what this episode is about is helping folks kind of begin to understand, or at least hear an experience, right, of what it was like for one Black child, right, to be in a system of education where quite literally her rights were being violated, right? And how you all navigated that individually as a family, etc. And in the larger scope, it's to help us begin to understand when we say systemness of racism in education, as an example, in this, for example, here, what that means. Because I think we throw the word system around a lot, and most people, I think, if you say, what makes up a system, right? They get stuck because they don't actually understand the concreteness behind it. So you said this in one of your communications. You said that, and this hit home, raising Jamison forced me to question and confront, and indeed to allow my daughter to confront institutions that I revered. One of those institutions is public schools. My mother was a champion of public schools, as are my sisters-in-law and cousin and many friends. I'm an educator at a public university, so questioning the decisions and intents of teachers and schools was exceptionally challenging and painful for me. But, of course, you go on to say we have to fight for our kids to be treated fairly. We have to realize that schools and the institutions we revere are systems of structural racism, and that must be dismantled. So that was important for me to share, because I do think we're on that precipice of where people are starting to question these institutions that they have revered and that they have followed along with, unquestioning, because we were from birth, that was just what we did. And so I think it's important for us to hear your experience in being able to realize I have to turn it upside down. I have to question it, because just because it is what it is doesn't mean it's right. And so, it's kind of piece by piece. We have to begin to take that apart and figure out how to put it back together again in a way that will serve all kids. I think that's going to be an important piece.
I think that, I very much recognize the idea that there's a right and wrong, or a successful or unsuccessful way to navigate the system. But I think that very few of us actually know that. Very few parents understand schools well enough to really navigate. It takes courage.
It does.
It really takes courage. You've got to go out there and do what may seem unreasonable, even to you.
Yeah.
And also painful.
Yeah.
Because, like I say, I think that, public schools for me, because of my family, I literally did revere them. I do revere them. I believe in them. For other people, it'll be churches or, other things like that. So it can be, those things mean a lot to you, and it's painful to, make those institutions face the fact that they're being unfair, unjust, or whatever.
Yeah.
But it takes that. You have to do that. Because it's our children.
Yeah. It's our children. There's no question. So, Henri, I asked both of the ladies here in your absence about kind of what this experience, not the one incident that we started with necessarily, but just kind of the broader experience of parenting Jamison through her education experience, if you will. What about that has been important to you now, and maybe another way to say that is, how does it inform then kind of how you're thinking now about this idea of how we begin to dismantle some of these systems?
Well, and again, it's a little complex, and my situation is different.
Yep.
So just to say this, I have 4 daughters. So Jamison is the 4th of my daughters.
Yep.
I'm also a product of the 60s. And as a product of the 60s, I remember on my wall, question authority.
Oh, wow.
I never grew up with this idea that just because they say it is true, you know, and through having professional parents, you know, learning how to do this in a responsible way, you know, so you're not an angry black man, so to speak. So, you know, that's all important in how I talk about this, because from my first daughter, I always knew that their ability to be successful in school was tied to my involvement in that education and that process. No, they didn't go through KKK hoods, but believe me, I was just as present and had to go to school meetings on their behalf for many similar same reasons. Sure. Which was just about, no, this ain't right. You know, the take-home message, you know, and I said this to, you know, when I think about this situation, and even as I think about it in my professional work, you know, one of the things I used to say to my staff, you know, I ran a bureau, a statewide bureau, and they would tell me about interactions they would have with, you know, some of our contracts. And I had this phone call and I said, oh, that's nice. Can you approve that phone call? And they said, no, you know, and people could say anything they wanted on a telephone. And at the end of the day, that's all about denial. Right. And so one of the things I learned, take home message very quickly, is you need to document. Yeah. You know, you need to, I firmly believe, going into that OCR case, if I did not have years of emails, of documentation, you know, what you didn't talk about, remember Mr. Burke? I mean, oh my God, you know, that was a year before an incident, and his father was an intervention worker in the other middle school. Okay. Thank God I documented that whole process and intervention that I was able to forward to the feds, you know? Sure. That, no, you couldn't deny this, that, no, we didn't say it. No, this didn't happen. Here's the email. Right. So I guess, you know, to kind of, what is my take-home message is question authority, you know, be present. You have to be involved. You have to know about your resources. And I think something you said earlier, and it is something that's very passionate to me, is I feel very lucky. You know, and at times, even when I think about growing up as a person of color, I don't remember going to my refrigerator and being hungry. You know, I don't remember worrying about, am I going to have clothes to wear and stuff like that. I guess what I'm saying is, you know, even, you know, there's diversity even within culture, of course. You know. Yeah. I grew up as a privileged Black person. Yeah. You know, and what that means to me today is how do I somehow give those same privileges to the others who, as I said earlier, don't even have those abilities. Yeah, you know?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I think that, you know, the parents of Black children have to work very hard to get their kids through school. Yeah. I don't think that most white parents are familiar even with the concept of it. Yeah. I bet they think they are. I bet they think they're working really hard, but they're not having to I should, you know, I don't want to be absolute, but I think they very rarely have to worry about their child being treated unfairly. Yeah. You know, whereas you never have a day off as the parent of a Black child. You never have that assumption. Yeah. You never can make that assumption. And I think that's true as a Black child in school. You know, you never walk through that school and feel safe. I mean, maybe, I don't know. Am I being dramatic?
No. Yeah, that's very true. I mean, even as, my dad mentioned, and then my mom brought up some things. And as I said, yeah, the very first incident I can remember happening in the school was in 5th grade. And then, it led into 6th grade with kids talking about how I'm Black Jamie. Came into 7th grade with people just bullying me about like how I looked. And that came from white students and Black students. And then this incident came. Then 10th grade, and then even 11th grade, 12th, college. It's all there. It happens every day. And so if I get even an hour just to myself, it's nice. It's never ending. And that's why the healing portion is so important for, I think, yes, Black folks, but then also Indigenous and other people of color. But why then the work that white folks have to do to really dismantle and also to throw in the word abolish and look at transformative justice practices is really crucial if they really truly care about the healing and reparations for Black folks and Black kids.
So I want to leave it right there. Because you did so much right there, Jamison, including bringing in the role of white people, which I would have done if you hadn't. So I'm going to leave it right there and say thank you to all three of you for starting a conversation with me today. That I really do hope that in different ways, perhaps with each of you, we can continue. And thank you for covering so much ground and being able to really give the people who listen to this a lot of entry points into their own learning, right? Regardless of what they kind of bring to the table. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. It's really wonderful.
Absolutely.
So we said in our introduction, folks, that we wanted to grab you by your heartstrings as we think about this topic of education and the system of education in this country, and specifically how racism has been kind of built into the fabric of education in this country. And starting with Jamison's story and that of her parents, Joan and Henri, was really important to me to do that. A couple of quick things, Melissa, and then I want to hear from you. A couple of quick things that were important to me. There was so much that was important to me. But you're going to get to so much of it, so I'm not going to go into it. I will say that one of my big takeaways, so many of them, but one of them is this idea of perception, right? And yes. We talked about it they talked about it at a couple of different points, and I think the thing that was lingering with me is a point at which Henri talked about, like, as he was so engaged in both Jamison's education and that of the three daughters he had before her, how he was in a unique position to kind of call people on their assumptions, right? I really could think to myself of instances of my own experience in education in different roles in different places, and how quickly we do go to assumptions on a lot of fronts, but in this case about people, and we don't flesh out what those assumptions are made of, right? So the simple act of giving people grace, I think, is the expression he used, and really considering the root cause of their behaviors versus letting assumptions drive the thinking. And that, when I think of the systemness of it, right, I think about like really having to almost say to each other as a group of educators, how will we in a very concrete way call each other on this, right? Like I'm thinking about like the assumptions police, right? Like people whose responsibility is to in a group of planners to say, hold on a second, that's an assumption, let's drill down in that. Hold on a second, that's an assumption, versus letting assumptions become fact or real or whatever. So I'm going to kind of just leave it at that. That was one of the things that was fresh in my mind, and I want to hear from you as you listen to our conversation, where you were kind of caught and what were some of the really important things that you took away from it.
Oh my goodness. Like you said, there was so much.
Yeah.
I have to say first, I was so moved by Henri.
Yeah.
By Henri's support of his daughter, his passion, his willingness to fight, but also his knowledge.
Yeah.
And his desire to have that information. I am really, like, all that, the word that kept playing over in my head as I listened to him was powerhouse.
Yes.
And I'm so excited to hear more from him. I hope that he will join us for future episodes, and not just on the topic of racism, but just in general.
Yes.
See, he had so much knowledge before this incident even happened.
Yes.
He had an involvement, which allowed him to have a footing that some parents may not have, as he said himself.
Yep.
So I know that there's like all this information tumbling around in his head, and I just want to dig my hands in there
and
pluck it all out. So I just, I'm sure he's listening. So I just want to say to all three of them first, thank them so much for sharing the story.
Yeah.
Because it would be very easy to say, that was a long time ago. She has moved on and she's fine. Like it would be easy to just not have to keep dredging that up. And so I appreciate them doing that. But for Henri, I absolutely want to say I can't wait to get more information from him and more of his perspective. You nailed the big thing that he said for me, which is that idea of the assumptions, the idea that if a parent is not heavily involved, that they must be lazy and not care about education. No one stops to question, could they be working? No one stops to question, do they not have the resources to get to a PTA meeting? Or could they be working during those hours? I thought that was extremely powerful.
Yeah.
And if people don't take much of anything else from the conversation, which I don't know how on earth they could not, but if they don't, that is one of the things I hope they take. This idea that just because things aren't done the way you would do them or the way you would like them done by someone else doesn't make them a worse parent, doesn't mean they're not concerned about their children or their children's education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have to learn to meet people where they are, and we have to learn systemically to have provisions in place for all types of families.
Yeah.
Not just the two-parent family or the well-off family that can do things that some other parents can't. Our school system has to be revamped to view and include all families. Like I say often, my grandmother raised me.
Yeah.
And while she did a really great job of ensuring that I was a reader and that my grades were good, she wasn't coming to a parent-teacher conference because she couldn't drive.
Yeah.
My grandfather worked overnight.
Example.
He slept during the day. She couldn't drive. Neither of them were coming to school conferences or after school programs or anything like that. It simply wasn't happening. But our school system doesn't think about elderly parents.
Right.
Or elderly people in the role of parents. So all of that was going through my mind as he was talking, because that was absolutely the truth. The other thing that really, it was two other big things for me, which again have to do both with the issue of racism and outside of it, is this idea that they believe their child.
Yes.
They believed
so
their
critical.
child, and then they supported their child.
Yep.
To as far as they needed that to go.
Right.
I don't know very many parents who, after they said, well, we'll just bump her up. First of all, wow, our daughter's doing so well that she can actually be bumped up to high school. So we'll take that and we'll bump her up, and that'll be that. But they persisted. Yeah. They went further. They went federal. Like, they did what needed to be done, not just for Jamison.
Exactly.
But for every other child that this could have happened, that this impacted, or for future children, so that this wouldn't happen to them. And I know, as Henri said, not every parent is in a position to do that. Not everybody can. But if you can, and if you're willing, it makes a difference.
Yeah.
Thanks to them, other children got counseling. Thanks to them, this won't happen to anyone else. Thanks to them, Jamison can hold her head up, because she could have easily, like, I just keep thinking about how easily this could have gone the other way for her. And she just been labeled, which she was, and she did have to deal with some of it, but like being labeled a liar or a troublemaker or, whatever. But now, because they took that fight the way they did and got the ruling that they got, she has some, I guess you could say, validation.
Yeah.
In the fact that it wasn't something that she made up. It wasn't something that she would have no reason to, but they took it far enough that they could give her that, and that they could give it to the other children in the school. And I just thought that was a very important message. And then final.
Before you get to the last, if that's okay, because I want to interject here where you are. You're right. Like they talked about they talked about the advantages they had, right? And those advantages included everything from Henri's previous experience. He goes on toward the end and talks about being a privileged Black man, right?
Right.
And what that brought to the table in this battle, if you will. He knew to keep email records so that he could show a long history of. They were comfortable with consistently bringing every single incident to the attention of the school. That was an advantage they had. Many parents don't feel that level of comfort. He was engaged, as you said, at the PTO level, the committee level. He was engaged in that district. Having friends who guided them to talk to an attorney, having the money to talk to that attorney, attorney putting them on. Like they had all those advantages that led them to the OCR complaint. But, here we end up, right? And we heard one student's story, right? We heard Jamison's story, and it painted a really insidious picture of the racism in this particular school, in this particular district. And her story was very specific to how she was treated, right? So we're not even in this episode getting to racism and bias built into the actual learning that occurs.
Right.
But that even with all the resources they had, and they had a successful OCR complaint, and to your point, because of it, it did all those things that you said. The one exception that they actually make clear to point out is, yes, it had an impact on Jamison and even the immediate people in that school, but even with that, they walked away knowing that it didn't change the system.
Right.
That her outcomes were based on the resources they had. They got exactly what they should have for her, but it didn't actually create or change the system and create those same opportunities for others. And we're going to talk about it in a future episode, right? But that really spotlights for me the systemness that is there, right?
Very true.
So anyway, I wanted to point that out because, like you said, Jamison got, she said herself, a strong sense of agency as a result of it. She said people describe her as resilient. So she definitely made, something very positive from it. But to consider that they did all of that with all those resources and it still left the system unchanged is terrifying. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
That was actually, no, I'm glad you pointed that out because I didn't want to give the impression that it fixed the system. That certainly was not the case. For that particular district, though, I have, if something like this occurs again, there won't be the hush of, let's just move over to the high school.
Right.
So that's the impact that I was speaking of, not the system overall, because absolutely not. Yeah. And we haven't even touched, to be honest. We're kind of blowing wind at what the systemic image is. Like the system is so deeply rooted with racism, from the way the coursework is set up to the grading systems. I mean, we'll get into that. But my third thing kind of ties into that.
Great.
And it is the fact that number one, there are people just as privileged who would not have gone the route that they took. So they absolutely deserve the credit in that fight. But the thing that really got me the most was the fact that, I'll be completely honest with you, I didn't know that there was such a thing as an OCR complaint. Yeah. I didn't know that you could even take that route. Yeah. And I don't have a clue. As a pretty educated woman myself, and I don't mean educated through the school system, but I'm as I've said on past episodes, I research on it. I wouldn't know how to do that.
Yes.
So I hope that this at least gets people, and I have been researching since the show on what it is, but I hope that that's what this takes people, gives them time to do, because the thing that Henri taught us, and Joan and Jamison too, is that how you come into a situation can impact how you get out of it.
Yes.
So because he had some knowledge coming into it, it was easier for him to get, I'm not going to say easier, maybe easier than for some, for them to come out on the right side of it.
Yeah.
So we say to people all the time, fight.
Yes.
Fight.
Yep.
Nobody tells us how to fight.
Yeah.
That's not something that you ever hear people talk about. You'll say quickly, fight for your children.
Yeah.
How? Nobody's telling people how. So I don't want people to wait until they're in this situation to learn what to do.
Yes.
Do it now.
That's it.
That's a part of what we've been saying when we say do the work. Yeah. Educating yourself is the work. It is part of the work.
Yeah.
So I hope that people will research OCR complaints, research what can I do if.
Yes.
Like type that into Google. What can I do if?
Yep.
But certainly I want people to do that if they have no rumblings of issues, simply because just like with Jamison, it can pop up and hit you in the face.
Yeah.
Like you're sitting around the dinner table and you hear that this racial incident occurred. So being pre-prepared, if there is such a thing,
yes,
could be beneficial. But certainly if you have rumblings of this in your area, in your neighborhood, in your school, if your child is at all mentioning to you that there's some tension behind what's happening in the world right now, because whether we like it or not, it's going to happen where our children are hearing what we say at home, or our children are watching TV and the news, and they're going to form their own opinions and their own biases, and they're going to take these back to school, and they're going to become conversations and ugliness. So if there are any, if you're in an area where it's rumblings of it or it's not pleasant, you absolutely need to know these steps. Yeah. You absolutely need to know what your rights are and how to be involved, and make the requests to change PTA meetings to days and times that work for other parents. Take the time to go visit your child's school on a whim and talk to the principal and just find out what's the buzz around, when we get back to a world where we're in school.
Yeah, exactly. We got some time right now, right? We got some time to learn. Yeah,
but you can request a Zoom meeting with the principal. Make your face one that principal knows. Let them know that this is a parent that's involved, that cares. Because even though, we all know there are certain circumstances that prevent you from being involved, that's probably one of the good things about the way the world is operating right now. Yeah. Because with Zoom, hey, anybody can show up. If you can show up on Facebook, you can show up on a Zoom meeting with a principal. It's as simple as that.
Well, especially as we use COVID as a resource from the perspective of really starting to recognize that universal, Wi-Fi access should be a right, not a privilege. And certainly that, that'll come up in future. So a couple of things that you said made me think of a couple of other things. Toward the end, as Joan talked about mothering Jamison, it resonated with me, of course. And, Jamison and Montana are just about 6 months apart in age. And so, the two of them plus Sid, they spent a lot of time together, especially when they were really little. And so, again, as I said in the beginning, it makes it very personal for me. But Joan talked about giving Jamison the power, right, to make her own decisions, working with her to figure out how to navigate struggles. And it resonated with me as a mom because I did the same with Montana and Sid from a very young age. Not jumping in to solve their problems, but coaching them to solve their own problems. And to the end that, because I wanted them to feel very early on this sense of agency, feel very early on this sense of I have a voice and that I should expect people to listen to it. And so we had a similar approach, and yet light years apart, because it wasn't until I heard her talk about this in this episode that I realized that it occurred to me that I never had to coach my girls to factor in how the color of their skin would impact the conversation.
Absolutely. It's huge.
The the potential solutions. We never had to say, okay, so think about like this and what would you do? And then, and now let's add on that you're black because there's going to be that, right? So that right there is how we have to shed light on how vastly different our experiences are, right, in this country, simply because of the color of our skin. And you said it, that our kids are listening, they're hearing, they're coming to their own conclusions, they're taking it back, right, into their lives. And we kind of recently had an experience with that with our 13-year-old who, now has Instagram, God help us all. And, so we get to monitor that and figure that out. But, she's hearing from all of us, right? So much conversation about social justice right now and racism, etc. And in fact, she's I'm sitting in her room as we record this, and in her window she has this handmade cardboard sign that that says say their names, right? I'm going to talk about that more here in a second, but but to the point I was just making, and so we saw several of her Instagram posts yesterday on her story, and we realized we got to pull her back and say, look, you can't just copy and post, right? Like if you're going to put these things out there, we need to teach you to research them and understand what you're putting out there.
Correct.
And act as if every post could get somebody to ask you a question. And if you do, you know how to answer the question. If you don't put it out there, right? Like that's how you take responsibility for your part in this. So anyway, it just made me think of all those things. So here's my final thought about this conversation with them. As I said, Cammie has this cardboard sign that she made sitting in the window here that faces the street, and it says "Say their names," which is a very powerful expression, right, of the Black Lives Matter movement, and beyond that, right? There's so much more to this, but. And then she lists all the people, right, that she knows. And by she knows, I mean who we've learned of and the people we do know who've unjustly lost their lives at the hands of police. Hearing the names of people who've died has a heightened emotional effect on us, of course.
Absolutely.
And as I listened to Jamison's story and that of her parents, I couldn't help think that if we began to list the names of every Black person who has encountered racism at school, how long would that list go?
Immeasurable.
So
immeasurable.
Exactly. And thankfully, those stories as far as I know, for the most part, don't end in death, but they do for us begin to shape the systemness of racism in education in this country. So here's the reality, folks. Okay. And I want you to begin thinking about this idea, and we're going to build on this idea in future conversations. Education and the economy are directly, significantly correlated. There is a positive relationship between education and economic growth in countries across the world. That's not unique to us, right? At its core is the idea that individuals are willing to take more years of schooling than what they're required, right? In order to better prepare themselves to take jobs that require higher skills so that they can earn a higher income. So education contributes directly to the economic growth, both at the individual level and at the nation level, if you will. And we see that in some of these other countries because they have higher levels of economic growth because they have labor forces that have higher levels of formal schooling that have resulted in people being highly skilled, right? They didn't just get a diploma in 12th grade and that magically meant they were higher skilled. They actually came out with higher skills. As a result, those well-educated labor forces have open to them, right? All those people have open to them a pathway to what I'm going to describe as a solid middle-class life. So here's what I'm getting at. I'm getting at the idea that the institutionalized racism in education in this country prevents a large portion of Black people in this country from accessing that same pathway. And without it,
absolutely,
right? Let's make the connections. Without it, that list of names I just mentioned gets longer and longer. And the number of people coming out of our system of education disenfranchised gets bigger and bigger. So education has to lead to a solid economic pathway for people. When it doesn't, for so many people, we create the conditions that we see now. And these conditions lead to unrest, and that unrest leads to who knows what, right? So all of that to say that this list might not be a list of people who've died, but it does in part become a list of people who were robbed of an opportunity. A list of people who are cast into the world with subpar skills, a lack of agency, and a sense that their education did not and could not lift them higher. So the question becomes, what then? Right? When you have such a large group of people now and continuing to come out of K-12 education in that same space, what then? Right? So, in a future episode, we're going to dig in to the conditions that are created in schools and districts that result in institutionalized racism being present and prevalent, and how we begin to tear it down piece by piece. Any last thoughts, Melissa?
No, just that was so beautifully said. That that is exactly what we need people to realize.
Yeah.
That's it wrapped up in a cute little bow for anybody that wants to have it just encapsulated. That's it.
Yeah.
It's the fact that it is setting people at a disadvantage from the start.
Exactly.
And then it bleeds into every other, when we talk about employment, housing, everything.
All
so
of it.
Thank you for wrapping it up that way, or for tying it up that way.
Absolutely. So that's what we're talking about, folks, and you're going to see future episodes around that. So keep tuning in, and we'll get to it.